I think that the best symbol of, I'm going to be talking about, it's kind of introductory work about misconstrual of cars on many different levels. And the best symbol of this gross misconstrual of cars is perhaps the cover of the Faber and Faber paperback edition of Orhan Pamuk's Car. It's probably familiar. I should have a picture of this, but I brought the book. You may know this particular cover. It presents a man who is walking in snow, obviously, dressed warmly, smoking a cigarette, clearly freezing. Around him, white emptiness. Behind him, in the background, the only architectural feature. And if we know the book, we would expect this would be something that is represented by Cars architecture. Now, but unfortunately, it is not. If anyone looks very closely, it's the Ishak Pasha Sarai, 6 kilometers south of Doyuk Beyazit, but distanced by road something like 200 kilometers from Kars. So that shows you that a book on Kars, published in London by a respectable publisher, has on the cover an architectural feature of something which is 200 kilometers from the actual place. It may well be, and I'm quoting from the description of Ishak Pasha Sarai, the ultimate Turkish chateau, one of Eastern Turkey's most familiar scenes, like India's Taj Mahal, as tourist guides for the more adventurous suggest. Indeed, it might just as well be Taj Mahal, perhaps anything Oriental would do. The point is that this particular palace has nothing to do with the town of Kars, either in ground architectural reality or in the eerie reality of the novel. Now, the big question remains, the big question for me is, how could Orhan Pamuk allow this kind of manipulation if he pays such attention to details? In Snow and in other novels, if you think of Istanbul or the Museum of Innocence or the catalogue to the Museum of Innocence, you might think that he has such an eye for architectural detail and for common things that he would never allow this kind of manipulation. So my thinking is, okay, you're a Nobel Prize winner and a respectable publisher approaches you, you wrote this city on Kars, and he repeatedly says he was in Kars on many occasions when he was writing the novel. And then he allows something like this, that's kind of one of those puzzling things. But that this is leading me to a larger point, and the larger point is that Kars has no luck when it comes to its chronicles. There were a few books and works of art before Pamuk's novel that depicted Kars's architectural and geographical landmarks. Most of those, however, were carelessly created in the past and are carelessly presented and catalogued today. Thus, the picture which I'm showing here, which is entitled Sturm Twierdzy Kars, which is the attack on the stronghold of Kars, 1828, an oil painting by Polish artist January Suchodolski, who was in his lifetime showing an openly pro-Russian, romanticized and sanitized version of the battle in Russo-Turkish War of 1828 and 1829. This very painting is frequently entitled simply The Siege of Kars. And because it is called The Siege of Kars, it is used to illustrate a completely different siege of Kars, that of 1855, during the last stages of the Crimean War. Now, for the students, for example, the English Wikipedia, another reason why the students should not use it so uncritically as they always do. Anyway, the English Wikipedia illustrates the item, The Siege of Kars, of the year 1855, with Suchodolski's work. In spite of the fact that it was painted some 2 decades before this particular siege, it refers to a different war, and in spite of the fact that Suchodolski himself never was in Kars. And he painted only a version that the Tsar paid him to paint. This is called royal patronage, I guess. And if you look at the painting, the river is majestic, while in reality it is not much more than a creek. The late 16th century Ottoman bridge, originally built of clean-cut basalt stones, is depicted here as having 7 stands and 8 water passes, instead of just 2 stands and 3 water passes. The hill is much steeper, the castle is much bigger, the city is more populous, and that simply translates as the fact that the glory of the Russian army is greater. because to capture the Kale was a greater effort. There were, of course, numerous battles of Kars, no doubt, during the Ottoman-Persian War, for example, in the 18th century, during two Russo-Turkish wars of the 19th century, during the Crimean War, and during the Turkish-Armenian War of 1920. But obviously one painting does not illustrate them all. However, work in progress. Though the very fact is significant in that the town's history has been grossly manipulated or misrepresented. Now, the British accounts concentrate, of course, on the Crimean War, and we have a few books, rare books at the moment. General Williams's Siege of Kars, for example, which was published immediately after the war in 1855. We have Frederick Barnaby's accounts of Kars of 1877, and a few other books which are mostly related to the military exploits. Now, not much of a recommendation perhaps is that Kars, or Kars imagined, clearly imagined, not seen, features also in the famous Spandau diaries by Albert Speer, Hitler's arch-architect. If you read, he was sitting in prison for 20 years, and he was writing those diaries, had very limited access to newspapers, but was of course obsessed with architectural features. And in one of his imaginary journeys all over the world, because he undertakes this thing that he walks in the garden of Spandau prison, imagining how many kilometers he does, and he in fact goes across the world. So he walks in the prison garden and he passes Kars, and he mentions this in his diaries. And then he also makes a sketch which relates to this imaginary journey. And under the castle in Kars, he paints his tent. Now, I think that the fact that this high-ranking Nazi arch-architect mentions Kars' citadel suggests both its military reputation and perhaps some military architectural allure. But of course, again, I mean, he's never been to Turkey. He's never been to Kars. He's never seen that. He's seen it in a newspaper which was illegally taken to his cell. I'm talking of this architectural allure. I'll be showing you some pictures at the end of the presentation, because if I started with the pictures, I would never say anything else. But Kars's beauty or architectural allure is mostly black basalt stone, which is not easy on the eye. I mean, if you really spend a few days over there. But that's one thing. However, contemporary travel guides over roads less traveled present Kars still as a kind of dirty place which is not worth visiting, except if you're really following Pamuk's steps, or if you want to go to Ani, which is the last place where you can find a hotel, right? But still, if I found a few quotes from contemporary guidebooks, and they say that the main street is awash with mud and potholes, which makes Tatvan's main thoroughfare appear like the Champs-Élysées. Nearly every building in this ex-Russian town, I mean, every part of every sentence here is something which could be debated, but was until recently decaying, neglected, and filthy. I would like to say that the same could be said of Erzurum, right? But it's not. I mean, this is not a particular feature of Kars, that it has this kind of architecture. But Kars is a town which is well suiting the conference on Ottoman cosmopolitanism, and this fact would not be denied even by Pamuk, whose reputation, at least in Turkey, is of a person who robbed Kars of its cosmopolitan shades and turned it into a paragon of the muddy, snowy, cold, provincial and conservative hellhole. Now, Pamuk's novel, however, although ostensibly putting Kars in the spotlight negatively, does not deny its cosmopolitan flavor, although in the novel this flavor is clearly evaporating. And I had a very difficult task, because I was reading Kars in a Polish translation where you find the word cosmopolitan in the description of Kars's history. So I immediately thought, oh, fantastic, he uses the word cosmopolitan, I'll use this for the conference. Now the problem is that I read the English translation of the same fragment, and the word cosmopolitan does not appear there. So I asked my Turkish friends, okay, please check the original Does Pamuk use the word cosmopolitan in this particular fragment? In the original? And of course he doesn't, which is not surprising because Pamuk as a Stambulite, I mean, you cannot imagine he would use the word cosmopolitan with reference to a place like Kars. But I'm going to read that somewhat lengthy quote because that quote contains a sort of very short history of Kars. It doesn't use the word cosmopolitan. It will use the word cosmopolitan in the Polish translation, which means that the term cosmopolitan does not mean the same thing to everyone. So maybe we should first, in the discussions that we have here, try to define the term cosmopolitan because apparently to different cultures it means different things. Okay, here comes the quote. Once upon a time, it's a little bit long, but I have to read all of it. Once upon a time in Kars, Kars was an important station on the trade route to Georgia, Tabriz, and the Caucasus. During the Ottoman period, many different peoples had made Kars their home. There had been a large Armenian community. It no longer existed, but its 1,000-year-old churches still stood in all their splendor. Many Persians fleeing the first Mughal and later the Iranian armies had settled in Kars over the years. There were Greeks with roots going back to the Byzantine and Pontus periods. There were also Georgians and Kurds and Circassians from various tribes. Some of the Muslims were driven out when the Russian army took possession of the city's 500-year-old castle in 1878. And thereafter, the Pasha's mansions and hammams and the Ottoman buildings and on the slopes below the castle fell into decay. Kars was still prosperous and diverse when the Tsar's architects went to work along the southern bank of the Kars River, and soon they had built a thriving new city defended by the 5 perfectly straight parallel avenues and by streets that intersected these avenues at right angles, something never before seen in the East. Tsar Alexander came here for the hunting and to meet secretly with his mistresses. With his mistress. To the Russians, see, I'm Polish. I always suspect the Russians of having worse intentions. To the Russians, Kars was a gateway to the south and to the Mediterranean, and with an eye to controlling the trade routes running through they invested a great deal in civic projects. The streets and the large cobblestone pavements, the plane trees and the oleanders that had been planted after the founding of the Turkish Republic, these gave the city a melancholy air unknown in Ottoman cities, whose wooden houses burned down during the years of nationalist struggle and tribal warfare. After endless wars, rebellions, massacres, and atrocity, the city was occupied by Armenian and Russian armies at different times, and even briefly by the British. For a short time, when the Russian and Ottoman forces had left the city following the First World War, Kars was an independent state. In October 1920, the Turkish army entered under the command of Kazim Karabekir, the general whose statue now stood in Station Square. This new generation of Turks made the most of the grand plan initiated by the Tsar's architects 43 years earlier. The culture that the Russians brought to Kars now fit perfectly with the Republic's westernizing project. But this is the quote in which, in the Polish translation, we find the term cosmopolitan. There's not a trace of this here. But the Polish translation says, in the phrase Kars was still prosperous and diverse, reads, zamożne miasto zachowało swój kosmopolityczny charakter. Even if you don't speak Polish, cosmopolityczny charakter, I think, is pretty understandable. So the prosperous town retained its cosmopolitan character. So for us to say something is cosmopolitan apparently is easier, I mean, from the Polish perspective. The Polish translator rather generously combined the concepts of richness, diversity, and late Ottoman times border town turbulence into cosmopolitan flavor. But this is yet another misconstrual which is committed on Kars. Now, contemporary Kars obviously is a town with a complex border outpost stigma. It exists in the popular imagination as a place without an interesting past, if it lives in such imagination at all, or perhaps with such a legacy that the sooner it is excised, the better. And actually, I learned that this research group never talked about Kars before, which only proves the point that Kars does not feature very high on that list. Now, in the last part of this presentation, and I need my glasses now, because the watch is on the wall. Do I still have 5 minutes, okay. In the last part, I wanted to concentrate on the architectural monuments that appear in Pamuk's very specific descriptions. I mean, so specific that, for example, if you read Pamuk and you learn in chapter 3 that he walked by the bridge and at the place where the old hammam is situated, he was chased by stray dogs. I mean, last month I was there and I was also chased by stray dogs at the same place. So that tells you that he's really detailed with these things. But I cannot concentrate on all of these elements because there are too many architectural things. So I started with those Russian Baltic architecture, and then I decided to limit it to balconies. And I'll end with balconies here today and show you a couple of pictures here. Balconies which are mostly black basalt, neoclassical Russian style combined with elaborate wrought iron, painted white, wooden planks at the base. Though the state of many of those planks is disastrous and makes those balconies dangerous, even in case of very elegant buildings. Now, those balconies at best combine exquisitely with equally elaborate front doors. And why do I start with balconies? Because this is where Pamuk starts, in fact, snow. In chapter 2, Serdar Bey shows cut a place where the old mayor had been assassinated, and rumor had it the reason was a simple municipal dispute, the demolition of an illegal balcony. The simplicity of this gossip is, of course, rejected by the soberly thinking townsfolk, but come to think of it, some of the pseudo-renovation of the balconies and facades do call for drastic measures. Although there is a College of Fine Arts in Kars, it is debatable to what extent it can influence the local entrepreneurs and homeowners to make them aware there is a very fragile cosmopolitan legacy here that can easily be lost. The climate is to blame for the damages, and I don't mean the harsh climate of Kars, but rather the harsh climate in terms of architectural awareness. How can people be stopped from painting black basalt into brick reddish? Or how can they be stopped from exchanging old wooden doors into what they understand as an elegant and modern doorway? And there will be no conclusion. I'll just show 5 or 6 pictures which will tell you in which direction I'm getting. But technically, I'm not that brilliant, so I don't know how to use those. Okay, that's those balconies at the best. You can see those black basalt stones, neoclassical Russian architecture, and beautiful wrought iron things. But you can also see some of the decay, but I mean, some of them are really spectacular. Of course, you have to be in Kars in May, not in January, to see that. But, it's really beautiful. I mean, but look at the wooden planks. I mean, this is really in a state of decay. Beautiful doors which match those balconies as well. And Pamuk writes a lot about this, but look what people do with these things. This is a black basalt stone. You can see those columns are neoclassical Russian columns, and look at the door. I don't know, but I think it pained me to see those elements because they don't really go well. Okay, that's the obvious thing. That's also Russian buildings, and some of them are in decay, but some of them are repaired. It's just to be hoped that they are not. There is some beauty in black basalt, but this is how they do it. Okay, so there are 2 directions. One direction is you paint it red, you put those doors, or you modernize it. But if you modernize it in such a way that you lose the whole, you lose everything, really. Look at this. The balconies are still there. I'm not surprised that Pamuk started with balconies and there, because the illegal balcony is just an example of this. Okay, some of them are left like this, some of them are in need of attention, but if you compare those 2 buildings, for example, the one on the right looked like the one on the left, and the way it was decorated, this is, I think it is rape committed on architecture of Kars. Okay, I think I'll stop here because I could go on and on with this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.